Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another version of Clark Environmental's Fun with the Environment. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about a common problem that we have here in Florida, and that's sinkholes. I could think of no one else better than the expert himself, Mr. Larry Madrid from Madrid Engineering Group, Inc. Larry, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Tell us a little bit about you and your company.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. So I'm Larry Madrid, and first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me. We're one of those companies in Polk County, Florida, that based over here, that we've done work with your company, Clark Environmental. You guys are out in the community and doing good things. And making a ruckus every so often. We love that. And we try to do the same thing. So congratulations on the success of your company and the upcoming 30-year anniversary. That's fantastic. So I'm the president of Madrid Engineering Group. We actually did a merger last year with a company called CPWG. And the company is now Madrid CPWG. Well, it's still Madrid Engineering Group Incorporated, but that is what we call ourselves. And so if you see the new logo, it's
I was going to say, yeah, what's that?
It's kind of the two of them put together and so forth. So it's very exciting. Madrid Engineering Group is a company that I started 28 years ago. So we're a little bit behind you.
Not by much.
Not by much, though. Yeah, we're coming up on 30 pretty quick here. And we specialized in geotechnical engineering. My bachelor's is in civil and my master's is in geotechnical from Colorado State University. I'm originally from Colorado.
Are you really?
I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, and went to Fort Collins to Colorado State University. Had an excellent engineering education there, and then when I graduated, there were no jobs in Colorado. There was kind of a recession going on. And I got a job offer from a company called Bromwell and Carrier in Lakeland, Florida. And they were a small geotechnical engineering company over there. I joined them in 1992. So I'm giving my age too here. But I started out as a staff level engineer, then I worked my way up to project engineer, and then I became the geotechnical department head. By the time I was about 30 years old. Okay, so they gave me a lot of responsibility as a young man with a lot of energy, and I was able to do that and help them with them. And actually, that's where I first got exposed to sinkholes. Okay, the company was doing some sinkhole investigations for a little tiny insurance company called State Farm. And
really?
They would go out, and there were not very many of them at the time, but we would go out and actually look at the structure of a house, for instance, and if there was a slope on the floor, if there were cracks on the wall, it may have been that those were caused by subsidence of the ground, okay? That the ground was literally dropping downward like into a sinkhole, okay? So we would do these investigations. And then in 1992, I started my own company. For the first several years, we were just doing other geotechnical things, which geotechnical engineering is the design of foundations, using soil as a construction material, if you will, right? Everything has a foundation. Everything sits on the ground or on something that's on the ground. It's supported, except for the space station, right? But everything here on the planet has a foundation. And in order to design those foundations, you really should know something about the soil or rock that it's sitting on. And what is the strength of that material? How does it react to a load? Will it compress? Does it stay steady and not move? You really don't want a building to be moving, especially if it's a high rise.
Do you do that by taking borings, or how do you find out what's underneath?
We do, actually, yes. So we do an investigation, what we call a site investigation, where we do soil borings. We go down through the superficial soil and into the bedrock. And in Florida, that bedrock is limestone.
Okay.
That's important for sinkholes, okay? Because limestone is made of a material, it's primarily made of a material that's on your periodic chart over here. I found it earlier, it's the calcium over there. So calcium is the main ingredient in limestone, and calcium can dissolve in the presence of water. So, so if you get a void or a cavity in the limestone because it has dissolved, then that void or cavity, it might stay there for eons of time, right? But it might get filled in by the material above it because we have another thing on the earth called gravity, right? And gravity's always going downward, and it will pull the soil down to fill in a void.
The limestone comes from where?
It's just a naturally occurring material, but it's in the case of limestone, it's a sedimentary rock. Okay, limestone's a sedimentary rock. At one point in the past, Florida was completely submerged. It was underwater, and so sea animals that are floating in the water would die, and their shells would accumulate down on the bottom. Eventually, that compresses and becomes a rock called limestone.
Gotcha.
Okay, now and by the way, limestone, because of that, it's in every country of the world. Okay, it's everywhere. It's sometimes it's close to the surface, sometimes it's buried very deeply, but it's probably one of the most common rocks. Okay, you'll find it pretty much everywhere. Now, a geologist, because I'm not a geologist, I took some geology classes to be a geotechnical engineer. But a geologist probably would say, well, Larry, there's some places where you just won't find that. But, my sense is that if you go deep enough, you'll find it. You'll find it, yeah.
So the sinkholes that are there, it's because of the limestone. How does that happen? How does a sinkhole occur? What happens? What makes it?
So the limestone itself, over time, you can have erosion and dissolution. Dissolving of the limestone creates voids and cavities. So people tell me sometimes, or they ask me, is Florida basically, does it look like Swiss cheese underneath there? In other words, the limestone is a solid, but there's holes in it. And actually the truth is there are voids and cavities in the limestone, for sure, okay? And they occur naturally as water is flowing through. So think about this. You've heard of acid rain, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you know that we produce acid rain if we have the wrong kind of, or too much equipment out and we're polluting the air, it actually creates acid rain. But there's a little bit of acid in rain water, whether man is there or not, okay? And as it percolates down, as it rains, it hits the ground, then it percolates through the soil, and eventually that water hits the limestone. And as it does, it's slightly acidic, and it will slightly, over time, dissolve the limestone, right? Creating voids and cavities within the limestone. And so that's how it happens. It's a natural thing. Softer areas in the limestone that just didn't get quite as hard will dissolve first, right? But then you'll have hard areas that just because of the chemical composition, maybe it's a little bit more resistant to dissolution. But we're talking about a geologic process. So we're talking about something that takes over very long periods of time, right?
Are there certain areas in Florida that are, say, more susceptible to this, or is north, south, middle?
Well, all of Florida has voids and cavities underneath it in the limestone, okay? And that's important because that's where we actually get our drinking water from. Those voids are it's not just a void, it's a void filled with water, because that water percolates down and it accumulates down there, right? And then we take wells and install wells down into those voids and pull the water out for our drinking water. We treat it, but then we distribute it out for drinking water, for agriculture and other purposes, right?
Do those voids get filled back up later?
Absolutely, they get filled back up immediately. Actually, think about it this way, the rock itself is permeable. It has the ability for water to flow through the rock. Even granite has a very low permeability and water can flow through it, right?
Okay.
Same with limestone, but there's a kind of a microscopic permeability of water flowing right through the rock, but then there's a macro permeability of water flowing between these voids and cavities because they get interconnected, okay? Somebody said to me when I first moved down here, there's underground streams in Florida. And I'm like, no way, I've never heard of that before. But actually there are. There are some underground, interconnected in the limestone, voids and cavities where water can flow through the cavity. Where we see this is actually in our springs, Jim, because where Florida's famous for its beautiful springs, right?
Right.
And water is literally flowing up out of the ground. Well, it's not flowing out of the sand. It's not flowing out of the clay. It's flowing out of voids in the limestone and welling up under pressure from some other place, maybe miles away. But that water will flow through and then come out of the ground and create a river, create an above ground river. But underneath the ground, if you tried to put on your scuba gear and go into that, you'd be flowing against a current. Okay.
So the water coming up, you'd be fighting. That's
right.
why they're so clean. That's where
Yes.
manatees and other things go, because I've heard that they're
Love that
warmer.
water. Yeah,
They're warmer too.
it's a constant temperature because it's that entire groundwater, right? So, but there are some places in Florida where that limestone is nearer the surface, and then if a collapse occurs, called a sinkhole,
Mhm.
then you're going to see that more often. So if the limestone's deeper, there's other layers that are overlying it, and it may stay a void and not affect the surface for decades or hundreds of years, thousands of years. But then eventually it's going to create a depression. Now, something else you might not know is
There's a
that
lot I don't know, but keep going.
oh, it's okay. That's why I'm an engineer. That's why I love this job. Something else you might not know is that a lot of the lakes in Central Florida were formed from ancient sinkholes. Where the ground surface was flat, most of Florida is very, very flat, right?
Right.
But then a sinkhole forms because there's a void in the ground, and that soil falls down into the ground, right? It goes down and collapses and fills that void, right? Leaving a depression that's bowl-shaped. And so it looks like this, but then if you look at it from the top and you're looking down, it's a perfectly round lake. Okay, if it's big enough, it'll turn into a lake because the water table's there, and the hole fills up with water, and it becomes a lake. If you look especially at downtown Lakeland, you see Lake Mirror and Lake Morton, and even Lake Hollingsworth, pretty close to a round circle, right? Those three lakes are perfectly round, right? And they're very shallow because the soil has filled in around it. Most of these lakes that are formed from sinkholes are a bowl shape like this and very shallow, like 7 to 10 feet of water. That's a lot of the lakes in Central Florida. You go to Winter Haven and you look at the Winter Haven chain of lakes. Man, you look at the map, it's just round, round, round. And sometimes you'll see them, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, and you can draw a line on it. That's actually called a lineament. And it's a geological feature that shows that there was a weak zone in the limestone that created this line of sinkholes that are now lakes.
Are there certain times of the year, like one I've heard is when we take water out of the ground, like we're trying to water strawberries and do things like that. Are there certain times of the year that are more susceptible to the sinkholes, or these occur at any time, any place?
They really can occur anytime, any place. Now, don't be frightened, folks, because it doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen all the time, right? But it can happen throughout the year. There is something that happens in the springtime, though, right around this time, as the water from the previous wet year, as it rains, it infiltrates down, and when it hits a layer that it really can't go deep and go through, it's not as permeable like a clayey layer. Then the water kind of backs up and it gets higher. Okay, so you get these seasonal fluctuations in your water table, and when it's the highest, which is usually at the end of the rainy season, That's called the seasonal high water table, right? And it usually leaves a mark in the soil, actually. You can see where that level is. But as the water is going down in the winter time and you come to the spring, the water level is low. Now the soil above it no longer has the buoyancy of the water, so it literally weighs more. And if it weighs enough, that force can cause a collapse to happen. And so sinkholes do happen in the springtime. There's a totally different thing that happens in the wet season, and that is that as the percolation from these rains keeps coming and keeps coming, it's pulling downward as the water is flowing through the sand and going down towards the limestone. And that is actually an extra force that can pull the water down and cause a sinkhole to happen in the wet season. So we kind of have two bimodal
So everything I've heard about during the spring, that's where they occur. They occur at all times,
Yes.
depending upon different actions, the way they put together.
Something that happened a few years ago was a man-made sinkhole. We can cause sinkholes to happen, okay? And that's pretty crazy. But think about it with strawberry farms down the road in Plant City, right? They've got a lot of strawberry farms. And when it gets really, really cold, what do? They turn on the sprinklers so that it will water the plants, and actually a little thin layer of ice will protect the fruit, right? Keep it from freezing. The water will freeze, but the fruit doesn't. And then later on in the day, the sun, melts it and everything's okay.
That's man pulling the water out
Exactly.
on its own.
So naturally, you have this water table fluctuation, but if man gets involved and starts pulling massive amounts of water in a 24-hour period, you can actually lower the water table tens of feet in a very short amount of time. And that extra weight can and does cause sinkholes. So we've had man-made sinkholes too.
In your experience now, because like I said, I wanted an expert, you're it. Smallest and largest, you've probably seen all kinds.
Well, let me give you a quick demonstration of what I'm talking about here. I asked you to bring me an hourglass, and thank you. You did that. This is a great one. If you start to look at this hourglass, you can see the soil coming through the little tiny hole.
Okay.
It doesn't take a very big hole for that sand that's in there to go through. So you can actually have very small sinkholes, okay? And you may or may not be able to see it, but over just a short amount of time, there's a little depression that's forming in that sand right there as the material is being transported through the little hole. You can actually see a little depression on the top there.
Right.
Yeah, so that's called a subsidence sinkhole, okay? It's where the ground is just depressing slowly over time, because this isn't happening like right now, right? The other kind of sinkhole is called the collapse sinkhole, where the whole ground just drops very, very quickly, right? And those are the ones, by the way, the collapse sinkholes are the ones that make the news. There's actually a hole in the ground, right? If it's just a subsidence, sometimes you can just barely see the subsidence, or you may not even be able to see it at all. You can only see the effects of it, such as cracks on the side of a building, stair-step cracks in a block structure. We see that a lot.
That's what I was going to ask you next is, you being an expert, how can you best tell where one might or might not occur?
So that kind of goes back to your last question. There are areas in the state where the limestone is closer to the surface. If it's closer to the surface, you're more likely to have a surface effect or a sinkhole, okay? And we have sinkholes in Polk County. There are sinkholes that we've investigated in Orange County and in Hillsborough County. But if you head a little bit north of Tampa into Pasco and Hernando counties, what's happening is actually the limestone is getting closer to the surface over there on a grand scale. And so more sinkholes happen over there. The other thing that happens over there, there's a very thin clay layer, and in some cases it's absent, okay? In Polk County, most places in Polk County, we have the sand, then a clay layer, then the limestone. And the clay has this stickiness, this attribute called cohesion. And the cohesion holds it together, right? So even if you have a void down in the ground, if this layer here is resistant, it might bend, but it won't break. Over there, they have a very, very little clay layer, and in some cases, it's not even there. So if a void happens, something's gonna get, and maybe even the sand arches over the top of it for a little bit, but then you get a rainstorm, and like this. And all of a sudden, all that material just drops, okay? That's a collapse sinkhole. So you have the two different kinds, and yes, there are some areas in the state where it happens more often and less often.
Biggest one you've seen?
Okay, the biggest one that I have seen was in well, it's kind of a tie. There were two of them, okay? The biggest ones are what I'll call the house eaters. Okay? They're so big that actually if a house is located on or near, the house will actually crack, okay? So we had one that was up in the Palm Harbor area, up in the Pasco County, Hernando County area over there, that actually it happened on the edge of a house. It took down their pool that was over there. You may even remember there were some memes. This is just a couple of years ago, but there was an exercise ball that was on their porch, and the exercise ball ended up floating around in the water of the sinkhole that formed. And so there was a meme online about sinkhole ball or something like that. That's kind of fun. That one was probably 150 feet or 200 foot diameter.
They can get that big?
They can get that big. It took out that house, it took out another house next door, and it got really close to the house next to the house. Okay, and so it got into the road, and so people couldn't get in and out of the neighborhood easily. They had to go around to other streets. It was a bad situation.
How do you fix them? I mean, how do you stop it? I mean, what can you do?
Well, let me get to that. There was another one that we did in Orlando, and this one was probably maybe 10 miles or 5 miles from the Wekiva Springs area, which is kind of in the northeast side of the greater Orlando area. And that one happened right on about the midpoint of the house. So half of the house was falling into the sinkhole when it occurred. The ground literally collapsed. It was about 100 foot diameter, okay? So about half of the house was sort of sitting on the edge of that sinkhole, and literally the house kind of cracked like this because the foundation that was holding up that part of the house was no longer there, right? So the house started to do this. You could see literally a crack right up the middle. People were in the house, and they heard popping noises, okay? Because the collapse happened fast, but the house was resisting the movement because of its structure. It didn't want to break, right? It wanted to hold up, but it's just like if you have a pencil, and you're holding it on this side, somebody's going like this, you can see it bending, and then eventually it snaps, right? If it gets weak enough, it'll snap and break. So this house literally cracked in half, and they came out of the house, walked out, kind of had to walk upstairs because it had already broken a little bit. They heard this, they felt this. Within a minute or two, they walked out of the house and they were okay. And that's the good thing about most sinkholes. There is some warning sounds if you're in a structure. You'll hear the sounds, and it's like windows breaking or windows popping, the framing of the house creaking and groaning as it's resisting the movement, and then finally it breaks. So that was pretty crazy, and there was helicopters, and the news were all over the place over there, and we had to comment on, is this a sinkhole? Yeah, this is a sinkhole.
The only one that I can remember is in North Lakeland. A friend of mine lived up there on the lake. All of a sudden, a huge sinkhole happened. You're talking 6 foot, 5 foot deep water, and here was this huge sinkhole, and they actually have a picture of one of the alligators going down the sinkhole.
Right.
And so how do you repair it? What do you do?
Well, I remember that that sinkhole, that was on Scott Lake,
Yes, it was.
which I live about a mile from Scott Lake. And that was not the first time that that sinkhole actually depleted the water and emptied out the water in the lake. Old timers said that about 30 years prior, or 40 years prior, a sinkhole happened and it emptied out the lake.
The lake would have been caused
Yeah.
by a
So-
sinkhole in the first place.
Let me draw a picture of you of what's kind of been would go on there. Okay, I'm just gonna take out this part over here.
Take it all. Whatever you need, take it.
All right. So
Show and tell everybody.
show and tell. This is the bottom of that lake. Again, it was formed from a sinkhole, or actually a few of them. There's a couple of other areas of that lake where the lake kind of doesn't really look like that. It's a little bit more elongated, and there's an area that kind of does this on one side. Well, that's a little tiny sinkhole. Here's another one. Here's another one, and there may have been 4 or 5 of them that actually formed that lake. But the sinkhole happened on the south side of the lake. So let's say this is the south edge here, and here's the north edge. All right, you have the water in the lake like this, and we like to draw a little triangle over there to represent the water. And you have a void down here in the limestone, and in this case it was over 100 feet deep.
Wow.
The soil started moving downward like this, and it finally hit the bottom of this and created a flow path for the water to go from the superficial aquifer into this limestone layer that's down here. This void was filled with water, right? But if this water had higher pressure than this water, then guess what? The water's going to flow in this direction, flowing down here and filling this up. Now what it does when it gets there, it'll go to the next void. It'll go to the, over this way, all the way around, and basically like this. But it almost completely emptied out that lake. Somebody else who was standing on that south end said that they saw some otters go down, they saw a fish go down, they saw an alligator go down, and it was swirling as it was going down.
I had another friend of mine
Isn't that
in the
crazy?
lake and had a dock. Dock was 4 feet deep, had a boat tied up. The next day, boat was sitting on the mud. The water was down.
Yep.
How do you fix something like that? How do you fix a house? How do you stop this?
Well, in the case of this one, the homeowners association actually called an engineering company and said, do we need to fix this? But what happens is you have this conduit here, right? This is actually like a pipe, right?
Yep.
But it's a soil pipe where water is flowing down like this, right? And the sides are very, very steep, but guess what? The sides this is too steep for it to be in nature, okay? The soil doesn't want to have something like that. So what happens is chunks of this on the side would fall in either it's called toppling in or sliding in. They call that a block failure, okay? Where big pieces of soil would fall off the side like this. And so what happened was this material here came down, and then some of the material along the sides, it started to squeeze, and it basically sealed itself off, okay? And so you would have a depression up here in this area. It would be deeper because you'd be less soil. But even eventually, when the water started filling up, it would continue to fill in that void. So it self-sealed, and they didn't have to fix this one. But for instance, if you have a sinkhole underneath the house, this is where the engineering part comes in. What we would do is we would look at this house, and let's say you have a void down over here. Here's your house, okay? And I'm probably not drawing that right, but you'd think I'd know how to draw a house. I'm an engineer,
Looks like a
right?
house.
It kind of looks like a house. I don't know, maybe. And you've got stair step cracks along the house, showing that this corner here has fallen down because the soil's going and trying to fill up this. What we would do is we would inject grout to fill in voids and densify the soil. So we would actually come in and drill a hole right here, vertical, and then maybe a few feet over, we would drill another hole, and that hole might go at an angle. And then we would drill, and so if you're looking at the house and the house from the air, you're looking at this house and it's typical ranch style house. We would put auger, drill holes around the house. And I say we, there are specialty contractors that specialize in this, okay? And they would do these borings, and some of the borings they would inject the grout straight vertical down, okay? And there'd be grout that goes into the ground there. Then the next one would go at an angle down underneath, and it would inject some grout. And then you'd inject grout here, and it would be vertical angled, all the way around the house. By the time you do this all the way around the house and do 30 to 40 grout points typically per house, you can actually inject 100, 200, 300 cubic yards of grout into the ground, and it hardens and solidifies, fills in the voids, and that house is not going to settle in.
Gives you a stable base.
Yep. So if you're thinking about it, what they would do is they'd come all the way down into the limestone. Here's your limestone, and they would start injecting. Well, when they got close over here, they'd inject some right there, and it'd fill in more. And then they'd have a little bit here and a little bit here. So as they're pulling out, they're injecting, pulling out higher elevation, injecting. When you get too close to the house, too close to the ground surface, if you inject this grout too powerfully, too much pressure, you can lift the house, okay? It's very high pressure materials. So they would have somebody surveying, standing over here with one of those little surveying instruments like this, and he's looking at the house to see if the house is moving. They'll put a mark on the house, and they'll watch, and as the grout is shoving down into the ground hydraulically from heavy equipment, he'd watch that house, and as soon as the house started to move, he's like, whoa, stop.
Shut her off.
You're done. Yeah. And so it's a controlled way of filling in the voids all over here. It's underneath this whole house, kind of within the zone of influence of the house, okay? So you may still have one in your backyard, but this house ain't gonna go anywhere. And that was kind of the objective, because the house is what is insured by the insurance company. Insurance companies would pay for this remediation of the house, yes.
This is fascinating. But let's say I'm a young man, which I'm not. Let's say I'm a young man and I want to get into this business.
Okay.
What do I do? How do I go? Where do I start?
Well, there's various levels of employment industry, if you will, of sinkhole evaluation, sinkhole remediation, that sort of thing. There are engineering technicians. It doesn't require a college degree, or maybe a 2-year science-based degree. But certainly you'd want to have, if you're a young person, you got to finish high school, right? Get those basics down, and maybe go for a 2-year degree, and you can become a technician and help and work with engineers like myself. An engineering degree is a 4-year degree from an accredited university, okay? And then within the engineering field, you have staff level engineers, like I started out as. You have senior level engineers. Usually by the time you get to be a senior engineer, you'll have taken an exam for professional registration. And so I'm a PE, professional engineer. And then you can become a program director, a manager, or even president of a company like I am.
Let me ask this question. Here in Florida, do they have similar geological down below anywhere else in the United States, or is it more prevalent here in Florida?
You know, that's a great question, Jim. It really is different in Florida than other places. There are 2 other places in the United States that have more sinkholes than other places. Florida is kind of the capital of sinkholes, okay?
Lightning and sinkholes.
Right. Yeah, perfect. Aren't we lucky? But there's also, in Kentucky, they have a lot of sinkholes. And you may, I don't know if you drive one or not, but Corvette has the Corvette Museum is in Kentucky. And there was a sinkhole that happened underneath their main exhibit room, and priceless Corvettes fell into the hole.
I remember
and had to be
that.
fished out. Yes, yes. Oh, it was amazing. Well, they built that thing right on top of basically a cave. And the cave was there because it was limestone that had been eroded and dissolved over time.
Can you try to plan ahead of time, say Florida and Kentucky then, are there certain people that can go in there and say, hey, you don't want to build here because we've done ground penetrating, we found problems, etc.
Right, so you mentioned ground penetrating radar. That can help to determine if there's sinkhole activity. Another geophysical technique, we call it, is electrical resistivity. And so these are two methods that you can actually get kind of a picture, a cross section of what's going down in the ground. They're not good enough to say, oh, that's a sinkhole, that's not a sinkhole,
Yes.
right? What it does is it will find what we call anomalies. Certain areas that just don't match the rest of it. And that's a place where we would actually drill a hole and determine what was actually going on there. And in some cases it was a sinkhole or a void or a cavity, loose or soft soil that was indicative of sinkhole activity. In other cases it wasn't. So it's not definitive, but it's a great way to evaluate and investigate.
Give you a good idea what's going on.
Yeah, so some of our clients do still call us and say, we're gonna be building such and such over here. We want to evaluate and make sure there's no sinkholes over there.
Like I know up here up in Lakeland, Amazon built a huge warehouse.
Right.
But they have called somebody like you and say, hey, check this area out because we're putting up this huge warehouse. We don't want it. Our merchandise going down the toilet.
I don't know that they did, but they could have. And they certainly had a geotechnical investigation, which is to design the foundations for those massive buildings. We've actually done some of those for Amazon and for some of the other big warehouses over here, where we've designed the foundations. So if you're doing soil borings to evaluate the foundations for a building, sometimes you can actually be finding out whether or not there's a sinkhole. If you find a void, you're going to flag it and tell the owner of that property that you found something suspicious. And then if you do find something suspicious, you might suggest additional exploration with electrical resistivity, ground penetrating radar, or additional borings. And yes, you can actually even recommend at that time before they put the building in that they stabilize the ground in certain part of the property, for instance.
Giving you one last, any parting words, any parting shots? I mean, this is dumbfounded. I mean, wow.
Jim, all I can say is I love being a geotechnical engineer. I love being able to help people that have had problems like this. We've done over 400 remediations of houses over the years. So we learned a lot through that process. We've worked with a lot of great companies, and it's a specialty area, So we do geotechnical engineering. We're still doing that. We have most of our staff in the Bartow area. That's what we're geared for. We have drill rigs. We have a soils lab to evaluate the soils as the samples come out of the ground. We bring them back to the lab and do tests on them. And we have some really smart geotechnical engineers, geologists, and structural engineers at the office that can help to evaluate not just sinkholes, but the entire foundation. What I'm really excited about is that our company, through this merger that took place in November of 2019, we now have over 100 employees statewide. We have an office in Tampa, Bartow, Oviedo, on the other side of Orlando. We have one in Jacksonville. We have two in the Panhandle, and we even have one in Missouri, in Branson, Missouri.
Really?
Yes. And so, and the people that we were on that side of the company were doing, not doing geotechnical engineering. They were doing civil engineering, designing roads, designing, evaluating sites for putting buildings on and so forth, putting in a shopping center or something like that. But they would be evaluating it for the utilities, for the parking lot, for the way that the roads, ingress and egress out of it, doing landscape architecture and survey. So we have a landscape architecture and a survey group, and these are some really talented people that have skills that I would only dream of having.
Wow.
It's really fun to work with all these folks now.
Larry, without a doubt, thank you very much.
My privilege, Jim.
Let me tell you something, people, I don't know about you, but this is fascinating. I mean, since I came down here to Florida, I've learned about sinkholes. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. If anybody out there has any questions, wants to know some more about sinkholes and that, send us our emails. It's at cei@clark.com. And what we do is next month, any questions, I'll run them by Larry first before I open my mouth. And we're gonna draw a name out of a hat for a $100 gift card.
Nice.
So I just wanna say thank everybody for watching. Next month will be 1 year anniversary for Clark. Beth Clark and I will do
Congratulations.
Beth Clark and I will do a 30-year recap of the past and where we're gonna go in the future. So thank you for tuning in. Larry, one more time.
I'm
Thank you
excited
very
for
much.
you. You're welcome.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.